We'll put Mrs. Baker there, next door to Mr. Barnett. Julia, you come here next to me. We'll put Sir Anthony J. there.
These people are veterans of one of the BBC's most ambitious ventures, the struggle in 1964 to tell the story of the Great War, or the First World War, as it is now called, on television.
The fantastic bitterness of the internal struggles, the bitchiness, the drunken rows in the BBC club.
To some extent, we were rather like the soldier. We were actually fighting under a cloud in darkness.
Why did you think it might be funny?
If we got the Great War wrong, the BBC would be in dead trouble. My idea.
I've been working in light entertainment before I worked on the First World War. This is something of a shock.
In the history of television, it was the foundation stone. Nobody had attempted anything on that scale.
For the maimed, the shell-shocked, of all the armies, the war would never be over. They had been through horrors whose memory would never fade. Worse, horrors that obliterated all memories and even the mind itself.
It's an old-fashioned British trick, isn't it? You try to get a balanced view.
In the early 1960s, television was still a new medium. The idea of using television for serious historical purposes was wholly novel. The BBC was stepping in boldly when no one else had trodden.
Ypres, a market town in Flanders. A beleaguered fortress guarding the last free corner of Belgian soil.
The series dwelt on the pity of war and its horror, but it also painted a picture of the old Europe which had been utterly destroyed.
The British first came to Ypres in October 1914. It's a gem of a town, with its lovely old-world gabled houses, red-tiled roofs, and no factories visible to spoil the charm. The first Battle of Ypres in 1914 began to demolish the charm.
That was the week that was. It's over, how it fled.
It's not just an old man's delusion to say it was those were the good old days. They were the good old days. For me as a teenager, listening in the BBC club to that extraordinarily talented group of people arguing and getting drunk and fighting day after day, that there was an inspirational quality about it, and they thought the sky was the limit.
In the 1960s, everyone who was young and ambitious wanted to work for the BBC. Satire was unexpectedly to be found within Auntie's bosom. Each night, its flagship, The Tonight programme, rightly stood up for youth against stuffiness.
So with the nucleus of some of his friends, a 17-year-old Davy Jones has just founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men.
But the mockers of Anglo-Saxon attitudes were to be faced with a sterner task: how to create a monument to the most traumatic event of the British past.
The Tonight programme was terribly hard up, and it always wanted cheap or free film, and one of the best sources of it was the Imperial War Museum. Of course, we knew that the big anniversary coming up would be the 50th anniversary of the Great War, and we'd found material from there, and it cost us almost nothing.
And one of us said, and I can't remember who now, I wonder if we could undertake a history of the First World War. Nobody's ever done it. And we looked at each other dumbstruck, awestruck really. And I said, well, you better let me go and talk to the guys up in the television centre and see if they want to know about this, because it's going to cost them, clearly.
Oh, we don't want to
the BBC finally green-lighted the Great War, a large, publicly visible effort was needed to launch its new cultural channel, BBC2. Tony Essex and Gordon Watkins were given the task of producing the series.
Most of the great creative things in television or any other business are done by obsessives. And Tony Essex and Gordon Watkins were certainly obsessive, in Gordon's case verging on actually balmy. Gordon, after a couple of drinks in the club, tended to get more and more emotional and more excitable, but he was a highly intelligent man who thought deeply and cared deeply about the issues of the First World War in that period. And Tony had this enormous charm and manic energy, and above all, he was a believer.
Tony Essex died suddenly in 1975, aged only 49. Gordon Watkins died in 1992.
Tony Essex was a lovely man. He was very funny, but absolutely dedicated. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He had this amazing ability to cut film at really high speed. Immediately, he'd know what went where, how long this bit went, what was dropped, how it ended. He once said, you don't actually edit with your scissors, you edit with your stomach. I mean, he edited by feeling. He said it was a quite remarkable skill, and tactically, it was Tony who was in command.
Now the hunt was on for war historians capable of giving credibility to the series. The choice quickly narrowed to two young historians, John Terraine and Corelli Barnett.
Corelli Barnett and John Terraine were both at the forefront of the ranks of military historians of the time. John Terraine, because he was very productive and had written this great Life of Haig. Corelli Barnett, he was a rather glamorous figure, controversial figure, young historian, and anything that Corelli Barnett said attracted great interest.
The team were given makeshift accommodation in a BBC outpost in the London suburbs.
I think we were all very surprised to be put into this Victorian terraced house in Hammersmith Grove, where there were 4 rooms which we occupied.
Oh, various places, but one of them was a horrid little hovel in North London.
There was no lady who lived on the ground floor, and it smelt quite horribly of cats and creaky floorboards and smoke and people running up and down the stairs.
The beginning was fairly straightforward because, of course, we had just a blank sheet of paper. There was no film, there were no veterans, and all this had to begin from the start.
Next, The Tonight Show launched an appeal for World War I veterans to contact the BBC to take part in the series.
Tony Essex asked me if I would find and interview First World War veterans. And I said, I don't really know anything. And he said, well, here's the book, Guns of August. Go away and read that. And I was going on holiday. And so I went and read that. And when I came back, my office was absolutely full of sacks of mail with all kinds of things pouring out of the sacks. Diaries, tobacco tins, medals, all sorts of bits and pieces that belonged to these old men.
Want the old battalion, we know where they are, we know where they are, we know where they are. If you want the old battalion, we know where they are, they're hanging on the old barbed wire. We've seen them, we've seen them, hanging on the old barbed wire. We've seen them, we've seen them, hanging on the old barbed wire.
I found that interviewing 16 a day was really difficult from all different fields, from all different fronts, all different kinds of men. And I had some really quite curious encounters with people who weren't really absolutely all there in the head and who chased me around the room with imaginary bayonets.
The greatest problem facing anyone wishing to tell the story of the war on television was the relative shortage of moving pictures. Of course, film cameras had been present at the slaughter, but their images didn't always adequately reflect reality.
You are talking about a time when cameras were pretty crude things. Film was not terribly good. The cameraman was standing out with the shot and shell around, actually winding a handle. And therefore, there is not a comprehensive archive.
It's about half the weight of a normal suitcase of clothes. You could about run 100 yards with it, but not much further. But then, of course, you have the tripod as well. It'd be very, very hard to use this without the tripod, because you have to crank the handle, of course.
When Tommy went across the sea to bear the
The combination of highly unwieldy cameras and military censorship on all sides meant that real battle footage was extremely rare.
With things going on all around you, and you've got minute adjustments to make here, just one thing wrong could spoil a whole roll. It's quite involved and takes a lot of conscious effort to set up a shot, focus it, make sure you've got the right scene, and then you've got the 50mm lens here, which is quite a wide shot. So on a scene like this in the background, people are going to be very small. So if there's going to be action, to make it look really good, you're going to need thousands and thousands of people and huge explosions. Two turns gives me 16 frames. There's 16 frames in a foot of film. They would usually film at about 16 frames a second.
Hand cranking meant that the footage came out jerkily on television, as if everyone was hurrying. By so-called step printing, inserting extra frames, it was possible to slow down the images to normal speed.
We were operating with film, which had lain in vaults at Hayes and Middlesex Public Records Office 50 years. Most of it had never been seen before. And most of it was in a shocking state. I mean, there were rows and rows and rows and rows of dark, dismal, dusty cans. I doubt that anyone had ever seen it.
It arrived in huge containers and in oxo tins. People sent their little rolls of 50, 100 feet, and every frame was looked at.
It became very much a routine, you know. We'd get there at 8 in the morning, and we would just sit and just... I mean, we were absolutely amazed because we'd never seen any of this film before. It was all brand new to us. And to our delight, it kept coming and coming and coming.
Archive for the series came not just from France, Britain and Germany, but also Canada, Australia, the United States, the then Soviet Union, the Far East and Eastern Europe. Like the war, the series rapidly became truly global in its reach.
The big breakthrough came when Tony and I went to Germany, East Berlin. These were the days of Checkpoint Charlie. We went to the archives and met a particular gentleman called Dr. Coady. A bit like Citizen Kane, huge desk. And the deal was, if you choose a piece of film, $10,000. So we almost fell through the floor. But that was the condition. We will show you the film here. But as soon as we committed ourselves, it was the 10 grand. So after about 3 days of trundling through a lot of fairly indifferent footage, started to pour through, and I thought, oh wow, this is it. I dare to suggest that had we not done this, so much of it would have been lost. And I suppose we felt a bit like a medieval monk picking up a document and thinking, shall we ditch it? Or shall we preserve it or copy it?
We tried to have all the British and French troops pointing left to right and the Germans right to left, so it would match in with the maps of the Western Front. And so we had to decide which to flop over. And that's why, if you look carefully, there are quite a lot of left-handed soldiers.
Scholars have fretted over the use of archive. Far from every frame is accurately used. Army training films made years later are made to stand in for actuality. But the filmmakers say that it was impossible to know where or when most of the film had been shot.
Illustration was what we were doing largely. We did not know that each individual piece of film was the correct for that day and that battle and so on and so forth. Because most of the stuff that we saw was undated. We didn't know where the hell, what time it was shot. But we made it look as authentic as possible to sustain the poetry of terrain. So anyone who says, well, we didn't use authentic footage, doesn't have a clue about what we're trying to do.
And this, if I remember rightly, is the cutting room that Brian and I worked in. Amazing. Good girl. Yeah, my bench was here. Brian's bench was there. And we had racks on the walls with cans of film in it. And Moviola was there. Remember, we had a rail here with rolls of mag on which we had transferred different marching speeds so that we could get some, because nobody marched on the film, nobody marched the same speed, so that you could try and match the marching speed. When you had a troop of soldiers marching, you could try different ones out to try and get one. But it's amazing to be in this room, which hasn't changed that much all these years later, because this is where we did it. And this is where we were for months and months and months and months. And it's phenomenal to be back here all this time later. Amazing. Really
And usually we recorded all the commentaries first, and we edited the film to the commentaries. We had all the film, and we were ready to go. We were waiting for scripts. I mean, I think it was a hell of a mammoth task for the scriptwriters.
In fact, bitter fighting had broken out between producers, scriptwriters and historians. This was the cause of the delays.
Tony's wish, totally understandably, was to make great television. He wanted to produce things which were going to have a tremendous impact on the viewer, and he saw the historians as servants of this process.
He wasn't too interested in doing it from the top brass, the general's points of view. Obviously they had to come into it, but it was very much telling the war through the eyes of the ordinary soldier, I suppose.
You handed over the first draft. He would digest it. He and Gordon Watkins, his co-producer. Gordon Watkins also fancied himself as a historian, and so they would go over it simply as a historical script to start with, and then there would be the question of how you could marry that to film. And at both these points there would be great arguments with the historians who were writing the scripts, firstly over historical interpretation.
Looking back, it's quite amazing how much work got done in the afternoon after the amount of drinking that in those days got done at lunchtime. But everybody was running on adrenaline, especially Gordon. I mean, Gordon would throw a tremendous emotional wobbly, I suppose, about every 3 or 4 days. And sometimes from the next office, where one would be sorting through photographs or going through veterans' letters, you'd hear, to put it politely, raised voices next door. as Gordon really got into his stride.
But then, when the film came, it might be that he would want to insert film because it was absolutely marvellous film. He wanted it, even though it didn't really fit the argument.
The arguments weren't just between filmmakers and historians. The historians couldn't agree among themselves.
I must say there was an awful lot of aggro and infighting which went on, and it seemed to me, in my ignorance, that it took a great deal of time to produce a very short, what seemed at the time a very short film.
On one side was John Terraine, who had written a biography of Field Marshal Haig and was wholly supportive of Haig's strategy. On the other was Corelli Barnett, who took a more critical view.
I could see the arguments on both sides, but I do remember one particular occasion where we took a taxi between the BBC and Bush House, and one member of the party actually said, "Stop, I can't bear this any longer, I'm getting out." We all thought this is going to be a disaster.
The argument over whether Haig had stupidly, needlessly wasted lives in his handling of the Somme offensive led to the very public resignation of the series' military advisor.
Basil Littlehart was the great defence military historical guru of the time. He was an enormously vain man, one has to say. Now, when John Terraine, and to some extent myself, presented a different view, he got extraordinarily huffy because he felt he was the guru, he had said what he had said, and everybody ought to listen to it. And so when the actual programme and John Terraine's script went to him, he wished to have his name taken off the credits. Bloody good riddance.
We didn't get on very well. Some people say it was because I was a bit bloody-minded about everything.
Were you bloody-minded?
How the hell do I know?
Well, you're bloody-minded, I think you are.
You do you? And should you know, I mean, are you an authority on this? No.
If you bring together 8 or 10 highly talented writers with 3 or 4 pretty many senior television people, then it's a pretty explosive mix. Some people, about halfway through, just really believed this series was never going to get finished. They just thought that the whole thing was going to implode somewhere along the line. Judah, I suppose, was by far the most glamorous part of the Great War Star, and all the veterans absolutely adored her. And of course, at that stage, we all thought of all the veterans as terribly old, but there was a very famous fighter pilot called Cecil Lewis, who was instantly captivated by Julia. And when, as usual, the wheelchair was lined up outside Broadcasting House where he was arriving for interview, everyone was rather rattled to see Cecil Lewis spring out of his MG in his chucker boots and nicely cut cavalry trills. I think he propositioned Julia about 15 minutes after he got into the studio and asked her away for the weekend about 2 minutes after that.
I obviously, when I started out, was not very knowledgeable. I mean, reading a few books is not really going to teach you about the war. And I learned gradually to have some idea, and I only say some idea because nobody who wasn't in that war could possibly have a real idea of what it was like. Nobody could possibly imagine the terror, I think, of sitting day after day trench and then having to go over the top and what would happen to you and these terrible things. Sometimes men just got lost in the world that they had fought. And there were several of these, but the one that I remember most was a delightful man called Talbot Kelly.
Suddenly around a bend in the trench, I came to a great bay. It was full of dead Germans. But they weren't a bit horrible. They had been dead for about 6 weeks, and weather and rats and maggots and everything else had done their stuff, and they were just shiny skeletons in their uniforms, held together by the dried sinews that was round their bones. It was a most weird and extraordinary picture, and I was absolutely fascinated. A skull, you know, grins at you in a silly way. It laughs at you, and more or less said, fancy coming here all terrified of dead men. Look how silly we look.
And we'd finished filming. We'd run out of film. But there was no way to stop him. Somehow it was impossible to break the trance. And eventually just stopped and said, where am I?
You can't help wondering, when you're making a film like this, exactly what is the relation of truth to fact. Because although all the facts in the commentary were as accurate as we could make them, then there was the facts that were given to you by the people you were interviewing. They may have been wrong. If he's fantasizing, you don't use it, of course. But if he's slightly misremembering, well, that's a part of it too. People do misremember, but how they remember it matters.
Truth is highly subjective. What's happening to one person at one moment is not what's happening to another person at the same moment a few yards from him. Also to say that.
I think the nature of memory was very interesting, because I think that most people remember several incidents very, very clearly, which may come to haunt them over the years. But probably their total memory of the whole war would not exist. It's fragmented. And I think that whether it's something they've seen or something they've felt, some incident has stayed very alive in the minds. And actually, after all those years, those to some extent were the things that could be spoken about, because the others had disappeared into the mists of time, really. You checked in all the obvious ways, like regiments were there and all the rest of it and so on, but you just began to know if they were making it up. You just knew when people were telling the truth.
There's our barrage, the Germans' barrage, and over the top we go. As soon as you get over the top, fear has left you and it's terror. You don't look, you see. You don't hear, you listen. Your nose is filled with fumes and death. You taste the top of your mouth. You're a weapon, and you are one.
In the end, the filmmakers won. The power of the series came from memory and film. But the series also struck a wholly satisfactory balance between factual accuracy and emotional truth.
We were perfectly willing to meet Tony Essex's wish to have lots of emotion, lots of the human story in it, and indeed that's why we took into the scripts the talking heads of people actually remembering what it had been like, particular incidents in the war. So we tried to meet him, but at the same time we were very keen to tell, if you like, a coherent story of the war. We wanted to get the actual facts over, the sort of historical pattern, and sometimes that fought against his wish to just simply go for the emotions.
The medium is the message, and I think the message of the Great War series is very much the medium. These terrible, terrible depictions of desolation and destruction of life on the Western Front. The Western Front dominates the series, inevitably.
Hell cannot be so terrible as this. Humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it is doing.
One begins to ask oneself, where is victory? And whether it might not lie in any kind of peace which would at least save the race. An artery of French blood was cut on February 21st, and it flows incessantly in large spurts.
The atmosphere as the series went on, yes, it became incredibly highly strung, because there were great fears all along the line. Was this program going to get finished? Was the whole series going to get finished? acres and acres of material that had been shot suddenly had to be junked because they found they wanted to do it a different way. Some of the writers proved to be brilliant writers for television, and others proved to be, should we say, less brilliant. And so with a good deal of blood on the carpet, some people found themselves being thrown over the side. Whole chunks of script were being rewritten weeks before transmission. There was a manic atmosphere.
Wildly over budget, with no agreement on scripts, and a deadline for showing the series now just weeks away, the Great War seemed destined for disaster.
Sadly, the film editors couldn't assemble past a particular point because it had no words. The writers couldn't write past a particular situation because they had no film to see. There was no assembly. And so we had something of a logjam, and it was Gordon Watkins, the co-producer, who broke this logjam by actually putting together what turned out to be Programme 11. This was the first breakthrough. The formula was set, and they knew exactly where they were going.
It now fell to the thespian Sir Michael Redgrave to narrate them. His mellifluous voice, dripping with authority and more than a little camp, lent tone to the series.
A regiment of engineers was immediately sent to Verdun to strengthen the defenses on the east bank. Time was running out. German deserters were crossing the lines in ever-increasing numbers with stories that all leave had been cancelled, that something terrible was about to happen.
Well, those who lived it always doubt that any portrayal, however meticulous, can succeed in conveying the truth. Cinema and documentary, as well as personal testimonies, exist as the best communicators we've got to take us, if we are open enough and have been encouraged to listen, and if there is a truthful voice, essentially, speaking, can take us as near as we can get to understand experiences that you almost cannot believe could have happened.
One of the most famous and bizarre incidents of the Great War was the unofficial Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers spontaneously crossed into no man's land to greet each other and even swap presents.
We knew we needed a particular shot of a cross in the snow, but no one could find it. And then eventually the program was being printed at Ealing, ready for the transmission on the Sunday. And I was messing about as usual in some archive, at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Another acre of film was going through, and the shot came up. And it was just, that was the shot. So I just picked up the phone, and I said, Tony, said I found this cross in the snow. And there's just a moment's pause, and he said, get it to Denham.
And I said to a German, excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom. And he said, excuse me, English comrade, camarade, but we are fighting for freedom, for our country. And I say, you also put, here rests in God, an unbekannter, held. Here rests in God, an unknown hero, in God. Oh yes, God is on our side. Blessed He's on our side. Well, English comrade, do not let us quarrel on Christmas Day.
We were tremendously proud, obviously, when the series went out, and somewhat relieved. I think we all thought, phew, wow, thank goodness it's all worked, because there was so much at stake. So much money had gone into the making of the series.
We all thought it would be a success, but I don't think we could see the sort of success it was going to be, the scale of it. And there were so many letters from people who'd been in the war saying, thank you, this is it.
I think there was a common feeling, this is great television experience. 26 episodes, all about the same thing, made with terrific intelligence and dedication, and you know, it was a real cultural event in the life of the country.
It did bring home the horrors of war, and I think it also made, perhaps on the plus side, gave an appreciation of what that generation had gone through, because they were a rather more silent generation compared with my generation of the Second World War, and never talked about it, because it was so simply too horrendous for words.
I actually feel that I went through the Great War. Because I was 18 months, I was so immersed. Well, I wasn't in the trenches, it was only 18 months. But I felt so depressed at times. And so, I mean, when we finished it, I was given 4 months off. And for the first month, I couldn't settle down to anything. I felt like I was a soldier back from the front, you know. It's probably had more effect on me than anything else in all my life.
At 5 a.m. on November the 11th, the armistice was signed, and a signal went out from Marshal Foch's headquarters to all the Allied armies.
Hostilities will cease at 1100 hours today, November the 11th.
Now, at last, on the 100th day of the 5th year, the guns fell silent. The killing stopped.
No more very lights going up with their greenish, wavering flare. No lilies of the dead in the night. No flash of howitzers on the horizon. No downward droning of the shells. No machine guns. No patrols going out. Just nothing. Silence.
I think it did change me. I think that every poppy day, every armistice day, I stand for my 2 minutes silence and I cry.